Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining for this online seminar at the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at the George Washington University. We are delighted today to have a book launch around the recently released book Navalny, Putin's Nemesis, Russia's Futures. And we are very lucky to have the three authors with us today to present the books and answer your question. As I was saying a few minutes ago to our guest, we are here in DC and everything is very much related to what is happening in Ukraine, but I don't think we can forget what is happening on the domestic scene in Russia itself. And clearly, Navalny's poisoning, then being in Germany, then going back to Russia, then being jailed has really shifted the Russia's domestic landscape and the way the Russian regime has been managing its relationship with the opposition and globally the civil society. And that became very visible in 2021. So the book arrived just really on time for us to have this discussion on Navalny's figure, role, potentialities, political features, and are really lucky to have, as I was saying, our three speakers with us. So Jan-Matti Dolboom, Ben Noble, and Morvan Lalouette, and I will give them the floor. They will, the three of them, speak and present different aspects of the book, but also give you some updates since the book has been out for a few months. And then we should have about half an hour for the discussion, and I will invite people to raise their virtual hand, so we can give them the floor and have that as a kind of informal discussion, more on the workshop style. So once again, welcome. And I think I will give the floor first to Morvan.
Thank you very much, Marlene, for inviting us to present our book here, and thanks to Matt for organizing it. Who is Alexei Navalny? I imagine that by now most of you will know who is Alexei Navalny. He was born in 1976. He had a training in law and in finance, and he has become the most famous Russian opposition leader, of course, now sitting behind bars. But about a year ago, when Alexei Navalny returned to Russia, that question, who is Alexei Navalny, was on the mind of many people, and not only on the minds of people who traditionally, professionally follow Russian politics. With his poisoning, with then the investigation by Bellingcat and Navalny's team that claimed to have discovered who tried to poison Navalny, and with his return to Russia, you could see a flourishing of questions and op-eds and profiles in the Western press asking who is Navalny and why does he matter for Russian politics. And so at the time in January 2021, Ben Noble got in touch with me and Jan-Matti Dolboom and asked us if we could recommend a good English-speaking book on Alexei Navalny, as he was bombarded with that question. And we couldn't do that, so Ben asked us if we wanted to write that book, and so we did. And so this book is our attempt to answer that question: who is Alexei Navalny and why does he matter for Russian politics? What can he tell us about Russian politics today? So to briefly present what is this book about, I will first start with a few disclaimers. So this book is not a traditional biography. We do talk a bit about Navalny's childhood, about Navalny's younger years when his political views were formed and when he started his career, but we do not delve that much into this. We haven't spoken with his childhood friends or with his family. It's not a work of investigative journalism either. We do not claim to have insights into what's happening in the Kremlin. Our sources for this work have mainly been the Western, but mostly Russian press, which offers a lot of insights and a lot of information about Navalny and his career. What Navalny himself has said along his career: he's a very talkative man, he writes a lot, so there's a lot to learn by just for start looking at what Navalny has written or said. And we have finally drawn on Jan Matidolbum's PhD and research in general, with in particular many interviews and surveys with the people who actually support Navalny, who have been active in his movement. And I think this is one of the great added value of this book, is also to present a view of Navalny from the ground, from people who actually have been associated with him. And to say a bit more about our objectives with the book, when Navalny returned to Russia, we found that there was a lot of media hype around Alexei Navalny, lots of black and white narratives about either an ugly racist nationalist or the white knight in shining armor who will bring democracy to Russia. There was also a tendency to either overblow the significance of Navalny or to present him as some irrelevant blogger that would represent only a couple of hipsters in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And what we tried to do in that book is to assess fairly and, let's say, objectively what Navalny means for Russian politics. And the way we did this, in order to make the complexity of his trajectory and position in Russian politics, was to divide Navalny's career, Navalny's activities in three dimensions. The first is probably the most well-known, is the anti-corruption activist, the second, the politician, and the third, the protester. And I will hand over to Ben, who will present these three dimensions.
Thanks for that, Morvan, and let me second him in thanking Marlene for inviting us to present the book to the audience. As Morvan has mentioned, the motivating reason why we decided to write the book was to make sense of Navalny's complexity. And another episode that I think really stresses the complexity of Navalny is what happened with Amnesty International in originally labeling him a prisoner of conscience as soon as he was detained on the 17th of January 2021, but then removing that label in response to information submitted to Amnesty International pointing to some of the controversial things that he has said in the past. But then the complexity was compounded when Amnesty International decided to relabel him a prisoner of conscience. So the book is really an attempt to make sense, not necessarily of that episode in detail, although we do mention it, but why a character like Navalny can both be labeled a prisoner of conscience, have that label taken away, and then be reapplied. Let me just read a couple of paragraphs in the beginning of the book that concentrate our thinking about Navalny's complexity and why we decided to write the book. Navalny is different things to different people. To some, he's a democratic hero, a figure willing to stand up to Putin's authoritarianism. Some even call him the leader of the opposition. To others, he's a traitor, a CIA paid agent of the West who's betraying the motherland. To others still, he's a nationalist or a xenophobe. Even a quick glance at Navalny's words and deeds makes clear why people might be confused. He's a liberal who's made nationalist, even racist statements. He's an anti-corruption activist who himself has been convicted of embezzlement. He's a Russian patriot who calls for sanctions against Russian authorities. He's an avowed Democrat who leads his movement with a strong hand. Navalny wants Russia to be happy, but attacks opponents with scathing comments and rarely backs down. As Morvan mentioned, the main structural way in which we deal with complexity is by looking at these three strands of Navalny's life over 20 years as anti-corruption activist, politician, and protest leader. I'll speak about the first of those two of those three strands before handing over to Jan to speak about Navalny as protest leader and his relationship with the Kremlin. So I think lots of people will have come across, heard of, if not even watched, the Putin's Palace video that was released by the Anti-Corruption Foundation very soon after Navalny returned to Russia at the beginning of 2021. I think it now has more than 120 million views on YouTube. And that's where lots of people come across Navalny's anti-corruption activism, but his own struggle with corruption began a long time before that, well before the beginning of 2021. And he almost stumbled into anti-corruption activism. In the early 2000s, he was an emerging member of the middle class in Russia. He started investing in stocks and shares, but quickly worked out that he wasn't able to get information that he wanted, such as what's happening to profits from these companies and who else owns stocks and shares in these same companies. So he went along to shareholder meetings and stood up in them and asked the awkward questions in a confident way that other people weren't willing to ask for obvious reasons. They might fear for their own physical safety. So he, from a very early point, showed a willingness and a capacity to command a crowd, to engage with questions that lots of people were asking, but as I said, were afraid to ask them in public. But then he journaled about it. He would post online in a blog, in the LiveJournal blog, what he did at these shareholder meetings. And he found a following very, very quickly, such that he swiftly became one of Russia's most famous bloggers. And that meant that he had a visibility, and he started to build a team of other people who were interested in taking on corruption, but people with other skills, such as lawyers and people with more skills in terms of investigating into finances. But Navalny also realized the political appeal of focusing on corruption and tackling corruption. It's one of those issues that is appealing to people of all ideological stripes. And so within chapter 2 of the book, we look at Navalny as anti-corruption activist, and we also look at the role of corruption more broadly in Russian society and how it relates to politics. We also look at the creation of organizations that Navalny founded, which at the time that we were writing the book were quickly being dismantled, which led to a rather jarring process of writing the book. In chapter 3, we move on from Navalny as anti-corruption activist to Navalny as politician. And we grapple with this complexity of the different statements, sometimes contradictory, sometimes alarming statements that Navalny has made. He started off in the Liberal Party, Yabloko, and quickly showed that he was a capable person, but also showed that he had a strong personality and clashed with senior people within the party. In chapter 3, we also deal with the statements that he has made that people have regarded as racist, nationalist, or xenophobic, including videos that were released in 2007 that were key bits of the evidence that were submitted to Amnesty International that meant that it initially removed the prisoner of conscience label. But we try and make sense of those statements, not to apologize on Navalny's behalf, but to situate those statements in Russian politics in 2007 and relate it to the views of other Russians at the time. But in the politician chapter, beyond looking at the question of Navalny's nationalism, we also look at his attempts to take part in formal politics. So we look at his run in the Moscow mayoral election in 2013, as well as his attempted run in the 2018 presidential election, which he was eventually barred from taking part in. And so within that chapter, we both deal with the ideas and how they've evolved over time, but we also look at how Navalny has tried to take part in formal politics and how he has tried at various points successfully and unsuccessfully to create broader coalitions, both of political actors, but also of the Russian electorate. So let me now pass on to Jan to speak about Navalny, the protest leader.
Right, thanks, Ben. And for me also, of course, thanks to the organizers. Navalny, the protester, is really not so much about Navalny taking part in protests, but Navalny using protests as part of his political strategy. So obviously he has been a protester ever since he's been politically active. He participated in demonstrations in the 1990s, but he has started using protests in order to build up his political movement much later. And that's really the story that we tell in this chapter of the book. So why did he turn to protest? I think first, because he was forced to, because he had tried to be a normal politician, what he has claimed himself and the phrase we use in the book quite often, but he has been frustrated in doing that by the authorities. He hasn't been able to register his own party. He has not been able to be on the ballot ever after the incidents in the Moscow mayoral election in 2013. And so he was basically forced to take up the issue of protest, or the tactic of protest, in order to be politically active. But also, I think one reason was probably that protest does play an important role in creating a political base, as we are seeing in many other countries as well. So we tell the story of Navalny's campaign in 2017, 2018, when he announced that he was going to run for president. And soon after that, released this famous video on Prime Minister Medvedev's alleged corruption, which became a viral hit on YouTube, as many people here will remember. And this was then followed by large protest events organized by Navalny's team in many cities across the country, which really were the largest protests that many regions had seen, at least since the protest in 2011-12, and perhaps in some places even longer than that. And so Navalny's team was smart enough not to sort of brand these protests as pro-Navalny protests, but as protests against corruption more generally, where many people with very different grievances, political and otherwise, could turn up, that weren't exactly Navalny fans, but were exposed to his message during these protests. And in my interviews, I really saw that many people went there for the very first time in their life. This was the very first protest experience for many, and this was inspiring and uplifting to many people, also older activists, more experienced people in the regions. And this was then really the base of people that Navalny could attract into his regional offices, where many people mobilized through this video and then through the protest events became volunteers, and some of them even paid staffers. So this was a cascade of events that very intelligently and effectively mobilized a political base. And this base was, I think, quite consciously a very hybrid thing. So on the one hand, this was clearly a social movement, people with very different backgrounds, newcomers, established activists, people from a left political base, liberals, libertarians, very colorful mix, who were usually united in their sort of desire for a change of political regime, for a more democratic Russia with, rule of law, functioning representative institutions and the like. So really a colorful bunch of people. But on the other hand, this was also a tightly top-down controlled political structure where the activists most of the time couldn't really influence what the top level would decide. So this wasn't really a party where the bottom-up mechanism was very was working very well. Quite the contrary, and this created some tensions within the organization, but it also made this movement quite strong and adaptable, as we find. So, which is probably also why the Kremlin has decided now to sort of take it out of the equation. And this now leads to the final point we want to raise here, at least about the book, and sort of also the final substantive chapter, which is the reverse perspective. So we also not just look at Navalny and his different roles and how he fulfilled these roles in political context, but we're also taking the look at what the Kremlin, broadly speaking, has done and how the authorities have evolved. So the main premise here is that the Kremlin is always confronted with ever-changing challenges, and the authorities adapt to these challenges as best as they can with the prime goal of power preservation, but trying out lots of different things and learning and adapting as much as Navalny and other people have been learning and adapting. So two examples of that would be obviously the annexation of Crimea, which shows that this adaptation process isn't just repressive, at least domestically. So we've seen through many analyses that this helped bind people emotionally to the regime, that it also drove a deep wedge into the nationalist camp, something that Navalny earlier has thought that might become the ideology of the opposition. Now Putin has co-opted nationalism quite effectively, so that's also an important reaction, I think. And the second example would be the law on foreign agents, which has been around almost 10 years now, but the changes that have been made to it over the years, and especially since 2019, making it possible to include media into that list of foreign agents, to include individuals. So this shows that there has been sort of a strategic change how to use this law by the authorities. And this change in strategy, I think, follows very much Navalny's actions and the actions of other oppositionists. So the point we here want to make is that there is sort of a strange dance, if you will, if you like metaphors, a dance between Navalny and other oppositionists and the Kremlin, in which both sort of react to each other's moves, and you cannot really understand the movements of one part without looking at the movements of the other part. And with this sort of, I close the part where we talk about the book, and I hand over to Ben for a quick round of updates.
Thanks, Jan. We'll each present a couple of points that we think are worth stressing, given that the book was finished in the middle of 2021. It came out in the UK in August and in the States in September, October. We, in the final chapter, follow Navalny from his detention at passport control in January 2021 all the way through to the prison colony and give a sense of what life was like in that initial time. But we know more about Navalny's conditions in prison since, both from reports that he's been able to get out through his lawyers, but also through accounts of other inmates. And it really does present a bleak picture, not in terms of maybe background conventional understanding that people might have about what conditions are like in Russian prisons. We see increasing reports of the torture of prisoners. From what we, the information that we have, Navalny isn't being tortured physically, but there is, if anything, intense psychological pressure, including things like him being forced to watch many, many hours of state TV a day. Now, some people might say watching TV all day, it's not the worst thing in the world, but Navalny's point is that this is an attempt to break him psychologically such that he might snap, and there could be grounds to keep him in prison longer. While I speak about grounds to keep him in prison longer, we know that there are other cases against him and other members of his team that could keep Navalny in prison for many more years. The original sentence is only for a few years, but I think it's highly likely that he will be behind bars across the presidential 2024 election, if not for much longer. We also know that today Navalny was added to the list of terrorists and extremists along with some of his team members. And this is another manifestation of something that really became clear as we were writing the book, that is the extent, the degree to which the Kremlin was willing to go to smash the man, his team members, but also the movement more broadly. And those team members, I think we've seen various different responses by them. Some of them have left the country. So we've seen Team Navalny, people like Leonid Volkov and Ivan Zhdanov, move to Vilnius in Lithuania to try and keep the project going. Although it's difficult to get a sense about what they are in fact doing. It could be that they're waiting to announce all the work that they have been doing, but certainly it's something that we're watching keenly. And let me, on that note, hand over to Morvan to speak a bit more about that.
Thank you. So yeah, of course, with the onslaught of repression against Navalny's movement and its transformation into a movement of exiles in the West, their operation has been diminished in Russia, and it is difficult to assess whether they will be able to influence future developments in Russian politics. The Navalny's team in exile has been keen, as well as Navalny, to insist that they had contingency plans, that and they are keen to show some appearance of continuity in their activities. I think that a first problem with that strategy is, of course, the disappearance of Alexei Navalny himself from the political landscape. It's a word that we try to avoid as much as possible in the book, but Navalny is a charismatic politician, and it's not something, of course, magical, and it's a public persona that he has built over the years, over a 20 years career. And of course, this is a loss that is replaceable only with difficulty. And when you look at what the team has been doing, in particular, they have continued to release anti-corruption investigations. They're slick as ever. This was one of the trademark of Navalny's team, is to produce very appealing content for, in particular for YouTube. but we also get a sense of the diminishing returns of anti-corruption investigations. Once the team had uncovered Putin's palace, of course, they can only attack lesser figures. And for example, a couple of months ago, they released an investigation on the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, which displayed the same high professionalism and the same largesses that benefit Russia's rulers. But of course, Lavrov is not Putin, and it is unclear whether continuing to use that anti-corruption tool will produce effects on public opinion. Of course, Navalny's team's operation has been basically destroyed in the regions, and this was one of the ways in which, as Jan said, Navalny had built a following in Russia, was turning to big cities outside Moscow and St. Petersburg, and the anti-extremist legislation in Russia is so broad that it can probably preclude most of his followers to continue their political careers, even if they are not formally members of a Navalny movement anymore. So on these fronts, of course, the picture is quite bleak, and we don't want to try and build a rosy picture for the future of democracy in Russia, all the more so since now Navalny's operations has moved to basically 100% online mode of functioning, where protest is ruled off as a strategy in the short term, and it remains to be seen whether Russia will ramp up its closing of its own internet, and whether Navalny's team will be able to communicate through internet platforms at all in the near future. And I'll hand over to Jan for a few remarks.
Right. So I'll close with two more points on the question on the interaction of the authorities and Navalny. But before I do that, I think a different take on this would be perhaps to say the best indicator of Navalny's success, or at least of his importance, is exactly the way in which the authorities have reacted to him and his structures. And one of those structures, or rather one of those strategies that he's been using, was smart voting. Like many of us in the room, in this virtual room here, know, this was the idea to concentrate oppositional votes on one candidate per race, and sort of ultimately incentivize this systemic opposition to become less systemic and more opposition. And they have been trying to use that for a few years now, with some limited but tangible successes. And in the parliamentary elections in 2021, the idea was to use it in the Federal Duma elections, which they did, and which provoked a much stronger reaction from the authorities, as we had seen before. So the sites were blocked. The authorities pressured Google and Apple even into taking down the app. And then even in Moscow, where it seemed to work in the beginning, the results of the electronic voting that came in after 15 hours or so, and then destroyed all the advantages that the opposition candidates had amassed, also through the smart voting tactic. So overall, it was not a great success in the last elections. The question is whether they are going to use it again in the upcoming regional and local elections in 2022. We cannot predict the future, obviously, but if it's going to work, then I think it's most effective if there's a broad informational campaign around that. And the question would be then where that broad campaign would come from, with Navalny in jail, not being able to speak and to produce videos, and also no protests happening. So the two major challenges by which they have raised the tension are blocked, and from the Kremlin's perspective, obviously for good reason. The second point and final one I want to make is the approach to information. So we've seen the Kremlin change over the years, and there's an interesting perspective on this provided by Guriev and Trisman, on the informational autocracies, where the idea is that modern, smart, intelligent autocracies do not use repression so much, but use manipulation, use the influence of the discourse and sort of playing down the regime's deficiencies and amplifying its successes, rather than blunt repression. And we've seen the Kremlin changing from some version of informational autocracy towards some version of rather traditional 20th century autocracy, especially over the year 2021, where the repression has been accelerating, has been much more public, and has been much more blunt and broad-based. So this is perhaps not a very delightful note to end on, but it sort of, I think, unfortunately fits with the reality we're observing. And with this, I thank very much for your attention, and I think we can start discussing.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. It's so good to have this kind of nuanced approach on Navalny, where usually the literature has been very much polarized. So we are really grateful for this analysis, and also for your perspective on what has been happening since the book has been out. And I think many in the room would share your vision. I propose now we open the floor for discussion. I invite people to raise their virtual hands so we can give them the floor. I see Danila first was raising it very early, and then we will have other people. I'll let you manage that and give the floor between yourself as you want, depending on who wants to answer the question.
Thanks for that, Marlene. Danila has her hand raised, but I think she also has posted something in the chat. So Danila, if you have a question separate from asking whether you can get a recording of the meeting, please do speak if you'd like to.
It's rather he, so
sorry, excuse me.
That's okay. As you said, some of Navalny's supporters were today listed as terrorists and extremists, and two of them, Leonid Volkov and Ivan Zhdanov, were put into this list earlier. Do you think, and I'm asking all three of you, do you think the Kremlin's fear of Navalny team is so strong that such serious methods of suppression are used against them? Because terrorism and extremism, it's like, for Putin, it's the labeling wars from the very beginning, from 2000. And to what extent the persecution of Navalny is an attempt to show the West that Western opinion means nothing to Kremlin and current Russian authorities, because we know that Time published Navalny's face on its cover, and the film will go on Sundance and so on. So is this in part a response to Navalny's popularity in the West and demands to release him? We also know that tomorrow, Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe will decide, will vote on the report on Navalny's poisoning, which is kind of also important. It's the first international organization which actually investigated somehow the events behind his poisoning, and Russia is a member of the Council of Europe and Parliamentary Assembly. So what do you think? How serious for Kremlin this Navalny scare, and how serious for Navalny that the West is supporting him?
Okay, maybe I can start on the point of the question of fear. So what we know from the actions that we're observing is that they have been taking Navalny and his organization very, very seriously. Whether there was fear involved or whether that was a rational calculation of costs and benefits, that's perhaps a question of theory that you employ, but what we observe is that they are really, really taking it very seriously. And then after these decisions have been made, which probably have been made at the very top, of course, a cascade of actions is launched that perhaps the Kremlin doesn't have all that much control over in every detail. So whether the actions against Zhdanov's father, for example, are really directed by Putin himself is perhaps questionable. But that's a clear consequence of the signal that came from the very top, that these people are dangerous, and that repression against them is welcome and will not be prosecuted, or will not be stopped. So and now it's probably happening in some kind of autopilot mode. Perhaps my co-authors can jump in here.
I was just going to say that when thinking about the threat that Navalny himself, his team and his movement have presented to the Kremlin, it's clear that the Kremlin's view has changed over time. They essentially sanctioned him running in the Moscow mayor election in 2013, but I think on the basis of the result works out that actually he presented more of a challenge than they originally thought. So over time, we've seen the Kremlin try to, I suppose at a minimal level, not block, but then increasingly try and block the opportunities for Navalny and his team, and then the real opposition more broadly in Russia, switching more recently to a clear crackdown. And I think that shows the extent to which the Kremlin just had enough of managing. They wanted to destroy this particular manifestation of opposition in the country. And so I think emphasizing change over time is crucial. And, you know, in the book, we don't try and get inside Putin's head and work out whether he has nightmares about Navalny, but we can infer certain things, like we can infer certain things based on Putin's behavior, like the fact that he doesn't mention Navalny's name. That suggests something interesting psychologically, at least. And on the question of the West, we're quite forthright in the book by saying that Navalny's fate won't really be decided in the West. It will be decided in Russia itself. And Navalny knows that himself. It's the reason why he decided to return to the country, we think, at the beginning of 2021, and not remain outside the country. Interestingly, he has said, though, since being imprisoned and since his organization was destroyed, that he has given license, he's given permission for other members of his team and his supporters to leave the country, given the severity with which the Kremlin has cracked down. So whereas before he said, we all need to be in Russia to be effective, I think now he's recognized publicly, openly, the fact that Team Navalny can continue only really if it remains abroad. But let me hand over to Morvan if he has anything to add.
On that note, I think you've covered everything. So we can maybe take the next questions from Hugo.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Hugo Klein. I'm with the Klingendahl Institute in The Hague. I have one question. Navalny can still communicate from his prison, and he has even been allowed to give interviews to a wider audience. So it's still not a regime without the right to correspondence, if you will. What do you make of that? Thank you.
Well, it's still very tricky for him to get a message out. I think one thing we've learned, for example, from the interview that was conducted by Simon Schuster that was recently published in Time magazine, is quite how difficult it is for Navalny to get the questions and then to respond to them. I've seen an anecdote where Simon Schuster has said that Navalny said, please keep the questions short because it's very difficult for me to be engaged in this process. We know that his lawyers provide a channel between him and the outside world. We know that there are steps that the prison authorities have taken to frustrate his activities. If the authorities were to decide to cut off Navalny's access completely, that would be really quite an escalation in already a dire situation for Navalny that would have direct implications for Russia's observance of the European Convention of Human Rights. I realize it's clear that the country is challenging, to put it mildly, some of those norms anyway, but blocking a prisoner's access to the outside world entirely in the way that the sort of hypothetical situation you're pointing to, I think is unlikely, because at the moment, yes, the occasional interview gets out, but that's largely to a Western audience. From the Kremlin's perspective, as long as it stops Navalny from being present in domestic media, it's really succeeded in that regard. But that's just my view. I don't know whether my co-authors agree or disagree.
I agree, and yet this is another episode that reminds us that we're still dealing with some sort of incomplete dictatorship, if you will, right? Where there are rules in place that are being observed, even for somebody like Navalny, who has been, challenging the regime head on. That being said, of course, it's also clearly communicated that these rules can always be revoked if that should be deemed more effective for attaining the regime's goals.
If Morvan doesn't have anything to add.
I rest my case on this one too, but I'll try to answer when it's not policy.
So Morvan, there's a question from Hernan. Apologize if I'm mispronouncing the first name in the chat. I don't know whether you want to take that.
I hadn't seen this. Let me have a look. So can we expect several potential Russian moves?
Maybe we should also read out the question for those who can't see the chat.
Let's assume for a moment the repressive forces inside the Russian society are blocked. Can we expect several potential Russian leaders will not be biased by a threat perception from the West and forced to act in an authoritarian way? I think it's a very difficult and interesting question, and I'm not sure I have a ready answer to this. Is how does the question boils down to how does the confrontation between the West and Russia today influences Russian domestic politics, and whether and if there was some kind of a détente between the West and Russia that could help for positive developments in Russia. What I would say on this is that many people in Russia are genuinely convinced that the West has not been the kindest to their countries in the 1990s. I think that these people have some grounds to believe this, and that, of course, this is something that any democratic or Western-oriented leader in Russia has to take into account, and that this perception of the West as somehow hostile, and can of course argue then about specifics, is not something that is going to go away in the near future, and that of course any tension between the West and Russia can feed into that narrative in Russia itself, that people who are willing to democratize or liberalize the country are only trying to play the West hands. But maybe my co-authors have some more to say about this.
I'd add that I agree what Morvan has said, but we have to remember that Navalny, if we look at his whole career, his concerns have very much been domestic. Yes, he might be supported at certain key points by Western leaders, but Navalny very much is a manifestation of the opposition within Russia. And so I think even if international relations between Western governments and Moscow were better, there would still be people like Navalny agitating for reform within the country. Of course, there will be an interaction effect between domestic conditions and international relations, as we're seeing at the moment, and we're seeing the authorities propagate this narrative of foreign interference, in which they can claim both that members of the political opposition and critical media voices, independent media voices, are not pointing to problems, sincere, real problems within the country, but are merely carrying out the orders of Western capitals. That's a narrative that seems to be being propagated consistently by the government in Moscow. And it's a really useful narrative, because they can say, if you come across criticism, something bad about the country, it's not because conditions are bad, it's because the West is trying to destabilize the country. And so it's an effective way to shut down criticism. But I think we've got to be careful in not assuming that if relations were to improve, that we would see much better conditions for journalists or opposition leaders in the country. To an extent, the two can be separated.
I think Marlene would be next on the list.
Yes, I have two questions that in fact arrive in my private chat. One is about the kind of criticism that has often been put on Navalny, that a large part of his crowd of protesters were very young teenagers. Sorry, I have the little one around. So what do you do about this discussion about Navalny's kind of follower being very young, and all this discussion about the role of teenagers in some of his protests? And the second question is about getting your opinion on this kind of theory, or maybe conspiracy theory, that Navalny had some people protecting him inside the elites, and that's because he was able to do a lot for several years, and that maybe there have been some also intra-elite fight and he lost some of its protector. I mean, it's a very kind of a difficult question to answer, but if you could give this kind of feeling you may have about some people who would have been kind of quietly supporting him just to offer some kind of diversity into the political landscape until he got arrested. Thank you.
Right. Thanks for these excellent questions. I'll start with the first on the supporters and their age. Of course, that has been around. It's not just a stereotype, obviously, because we can see young people attending rallies more so than older people do. But it has been certainly used by the authorities and state-aligned media to placate Navalny as a manipulator of the country's youth, or of a particular social group that is perhaps most vulnerable to manipulation. That was the narrative that was being produced. And we take issue with that narrative in the book. We say it's rather the other way around, that many people with grievances try to use Navalny as an instrument in their quest for political change. But still the question is whether he mobilizes young people to a greater degree. And there's very little data on that, but there are some studies. Elena Nikolaenko has recently published a paper documenting that the share of students in a city has been one factor that accounts for the size of Navalny rallies in, I think it was 2017. And I also have done work with Elena Sirotkina and Andrei Semyonov. We've been doing a survey among Navalny supporters in social media, in Vkontakte. And there we see, obviously, this is already a young sample because these are social media users, but even among that sample, the under 18-year-olds are not in the majority. There we have sort of a median age of 23, 25, which is really a different demographic than you would expect when you're just looking at the media output on the teenagers supporting Navalny. So maybe in all brevity on that. Do the others want to jump in on the second question? Or should I take a stab at it as well?
Go for it.
Okay. So the protection inside the elite, obviously Navalny denies that. But there is the possibility that somebody wanted to use Navalny in their own intra-elite battles and sending him information. I wouldn't exclude that. And then Navalny would perhaps, from the person of that elite person, from the perspective of that elite person, be in sort of their guy, but Navalny would probably then just use that information because it helps to undermine credibility in the regime in general. So of course we don't know whether that's the case or not, but I would think it's highly unlikely that he would submit to just one clan. Perhaps he uses information that is supplied to him from different sides, but that's I think all we can really credibly say about this.
So
Ben, do you want to chip in on this one, or we take another?
Yeah, I think Jan has summarized the fact that, you know, we touch on it in the book shortly. We say that this has always been something that has followed Navalny around, this suspicion, but we don't get into it because of limitations of information. But also we don't say that it's not true. We are essentially agnostic on the point. But we can turn, I think, to Kirill Melnikov. Kirill, good to see you.
Yeah, great to see you. Many thanks for your presentation. Probably I missed the point, but if you can expand on it, that would be great. So what your research does say about the impact of Navalny's return on public opinion in Russia on him? Because we know that the return probably made huge impact on the perception of Navalny in the West. So, for example, he was included into the list of Time 100 most influential person. He received Sakharov Prize, and probably the most common word that was coming hand to hand in Western media when they spoke about Navalny is hero. Do we have something similar in Russia? Is there any real change in public opinion about him after his return? Thank you.
I will start, and maybe my brothers will have something to add. I think that it's something that we have to take stock of, is that the reaction to Navalny's return in Russia has been much more muted in Russia probably than it has in the West, and it has not, from what we can see now, really transformed its status as it has in the West. Of course, there are reasons for this. At the same time, and I think this is also what we try to show in the book, is that Navalny's fate isn't isolated from what is going on more generally in Russia. And as we've seen that escalation of repression against Navalny, we've also seen the escalation of repression against free media in Russia. We've also seen the escalation of repression against protests. And I think it's fair to say that the demonstrations protesting Navalny's arrest were among the most heavily repressed in recent Russian history. But that being said, there remains the fact that his return, him being sent to jail, has not provoked a massive outrage in Russia. Now, I think that many people, I don't know if it's your case, but I will address that question anyway. Many people I've read are asking themselves whether, in light of this, it would have been better for Navalny to remain abroad. And I think that this is something that we cannot really answer, because it's quite likely, in my view at least, that had Navalny remained in Germany, his movement could also have been destroyed and heavily repressed as it has been, since in this case they would have had that excuse that Navalny was leading an oppositional movement from abroad, from hostile countries, and we already had this kind of reports when Navalny was treated in Germany, that he was treated by doctors from the German army. So I think that we're in a situation where it's very difficult to assess whether or not that decision influenced that much the fate of his movement or the fate of politics in Russia more generally. But maybe Jan and Ben want to chip in on this.
Well, if we just look at opinion polls, then this hasn't been such a great move. But the question is whether the alternative would have been better, and I doubt that would have been the case. Of course, that's a methodological, insolvable problem. But the share of people supporting Navalny stood at about 20% in Levada surveys at the beginning of the year, and by mid-year 2021 it was at about 14%. So it went down a few percentage points, which probably reflects a real trend. But the question is what the causes of this trend are. Whether that's a greater reluctance to answer such politically charged questions, or whether that's a reaction to the labeling as an extremist, which really perhaps has convinced some people that this isn't such a good man. who knows? We don't know much more about this, but as I said, the question is whether those figures would have changed if he had stayed outside the country. We don't know.
And just to add to that, the subtitle of the book is Putin's Nemesis, Russia's Future ? And so we're asking, is it plausible that he could be the country's future? And we are pessimistic at the end of the book. We are on the basis of the evidence that we go through in the book. It's unlikely that he is the country's future, and that's particular conclusion only is stronger given what has happened to him and his movement in 2021. So it could be that one of the reasons why those figures, the support figures from Nevada polling, have fallen from 2014 is because people no longer see him as the future where maybe they once did, although with all of the provisos, all the caveats given regarding those polling figures, given the media environment, as well as given possible fear of negative consequences for people showing support for an individual and a movement that has been labeled extremist.
So, Daniela, it seems.
Yes, actually, I wanted to ask Marlene, because her analysis is always very, very good and relevant and so on. Marlene, can you say your opinion about to what extent Navalny is Putin's nemesis? I mean, is it possible that his influence and his impact to society will go bigger with approaching of 2024 and beyond?
Well, I don't think I will be answering that question in the few minutes we have, and I really want to give the floor to our speaker. They are the one who wrote the book, not me, but I think they show very clearly that Navalny is a product of today's Russia, working in today's Russia condition, and so there are, of course, parallels that may be done, or kind of contexts that are putting both Navalny and Putin in parallel. And I think the way our author has been describing this kind of back and forth between the opposition and the regimes is really telling us how much it has got interlinked. And maybe that's a sign also of Navalny's success, in a sense, to have been strong enough that the regime has to reply to him. But if we still have 2-3 minutes, maybe a short conclusion on the what you were mentioning related to the change of the move toward a more repressive control of internet, and how this could impact on the long run the kind of YouTube visibility and social media presence of the Navalny team globally. And maybe we could conclude on that.
That sounds great. If I could just respond to Daniela's point about whether Navalny is in fact Putin's nemesis, one thing we try and do in the book is show that Navalny could present a challenge to Putin and Putinism more broadly, without, for example, being in a position that he would beat Putin in a presidential election. We're saying framing things like that is counterproductive, that we show Navalny's significance without tying it to electoral prospects, and that you can make sense of Navalny's significance in the various different ways that we do in the book. But on the question of the internet, I'll hand over to my co-authors.
I think we've seen, oh, go ahead, Mabel. No? Right. So we've gotten a pre-taste of what the authorities are ready to do around the elections, when, for example, they didn't shy away from pressuring global firms into conforming with politically motivated applications of laws. So that's just, that could just be the beginning. I mean, they have tried to shut down Telegram a few years back, which was perhaps rather amateurish, but they have gotten a lot better at these things recently. And so everything we saw in the past year points to the, to the idea that they're ready to do whatever it takes in their view to preserve power. Unfortunately, I think it has to be said as bluntly as that, and that includes mass repression. I mean, we're still not there yet, right? We're still not in in mass repression territory, what we see in other, even more classical dictatorships. But I think after what we've seen over the past months, that's not ruled out. And if there was a challenge to arise, and that challenge was probably not going to come from Team Navalny in the short term, it is, if it comes from more domestic, perhaps, sources, and perhaps more economically motivated grievances. And if that poses a challenge to the power distribution, then that will be crushed. I think it's pretty clear.
Well, if that is our final word, I wanted to thank you all for this really great presentation. I invite people in the audience really to read the book. That's the best book, the most nuanced we have on Navalny. So congratulations again on writing it, and thank you so much for being with us today, and hope to see everybody very soon for other seminars. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.